Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome the members of council, staff, and members of the public to discuss the proposed zoning bylaw amendments and call this meeting to order. The details, the amended application submitted on August 23rd, 2024 by Senior Planner Mr. Trevor Benjamins for an overall zoning bylaw housekeeping amendment under Section 34 of the Planning Act, RSO 1990 as amended, and this applies to all lands within the town of Petrolia. This is a public information session held for the purpose of public engagement under the Planning Act with the public, council, and staff. During a public information session, no member discusses or otherwise deals with any matter in any way that materially advances the business or decision-making of council. At this time, I'd like to ask Mrs. Pearson for the land acknowledgement, please.
Thank you. We acknowledge that this land on which we are gathered today is part of the ancestral land of the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, referred to collectively as the Anishinaabe. The town of Petrolia is located on the lands associated with the Huron-Tract Treaty number 29 of 1827. We express gratitude for the land where we live, work, and play, and we are committed to working respectfully and with the land and the Indigenous peoples who have called this land home.
Thank you. Purpose of the meeting, I just want to make this clear, is to afford the public an opportunity under the Act to receive information relating to the proposed amendments of the Town of Petrolia zoning bylaw 63 of 2017, to provide input to town staff and council, and it's in relation to the proposed an amendment for additional dwelling units or ADUs on residential lots within the Town of Petrolia. Again, this meeting is specific to the application noted above. Any comments you wish to submit in relation to a draft plan of subdivision, subdivision agreement, or other items not related to the above application shall be done when appropriate to the specific application. Submissions off topic and not in relation to the proposed application shall not be brought forward. And if you want any clarification, please contact the clerk's office. At this time, I would like to introduce the councils present. On your right, my left, we have Councillor Patel, Councillor Hyatt, Deputy Mayor Field, Councillor O'Hara, Councillor Welch, Councillor Clark, and I, R. Brad Loosely, Mayor. And I'd like to ask Mrs. Pearson to introduce the staff present, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. And that will also be going starting from my left. Mike Thompson, Director of Operations. Julie Bullock, Director of Parks, Recreation and Facilities. Larissa Ellsworth, Director of Marketing, Arts and Communication. Mr. Trevor Benjamins, Senior Planner. Ms. Leanne Biger, who is our Executive Assistant for Legislative Services. Jess Smith, who is our Manager of Legislative Services, Deputy Clerk, our CAO Treasurer, Rick Charlevoix, and I am your Clerk, Mandy Pearson.
Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. At this time, we'll move on to the confirmation of public notice, and I'll ask Mrs. Pearson to speak to that, please.
Thank you. And so the Petrolia Independent, we had articles ran on September 5th and 12th. Email and mail to the required agencies took place on September 3rd, 2024. Website and public notice posting on August 29th, 2024. And the mail caveat, we completed this through the September Petrolia Connection, as this is a blanket amendment, so all residents were advised through the Petrolia Connection.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Pearson. At this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Trevor Benjamins, our Senior Planner, to come forward, please, and to give his report.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council, members of staff present, and members of the public. I'm going to be giving a short presentation this evening on a proposed housekeeping zoning bylaw amendment for additional dwelling units within the town of Petrolia. Next slide, please. So what is an ADU? ADUs are additional units contained within either the principal, that's the primary residence on a lot, such as a single detached dwelling, a semi-detached dwelling, or within a townhouse, or they can be within an accessory structure. ADUs are excellent beginning housing options. They are options for downsizing or for opportunities for multi-generational housing. ADUs can assist in providing more affordable housing options within the town of Petrolia. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of history on ADUs. Planning is a provincial responsibility, and that's enabled through the Planning Act. Provinces express the provincial interest in good planning via the Act and the Provincial Policy Statement 2020. Municipalities such as the town of Petrolia must comply with the Act and be consistent with provincial policy. I just want to add here that there is a new PPS. It's going to be the Provincial Planning Statement that's going to come into effect on October 20th of this year, which you'll see more reports from me in the near future on. Next slide, please. So the Planning Act originally enabled one additional dwelling unit, which municipalities had to implement. So both our previous official plan and our current zoning bylaw do comply with this. However, Bill 23, which is the More Homes Built Faster Act, increased this to 2 ADUs on a parcel, either within the primary dwelling or in an accessory building. Bill 23 changes took effect on November 28th. That's the day it received royal assent, and these changes are mandatory. These changes override our municipal official plan and the zoning bylaw and allow as-of-right development. So these changes can create some inconsistencies in our current zoning provisions. So this is really an amendment to realign our policies with the Planning Act. Next slide, please. On the screens behind council, you will see that some examples of what ADUs could look like on a lot. So some examples include a backyard suite, a unit above an accessory structure such as a garage, or units within the primary dwelling such as in the basement or on a floor of a structure. Next slide, please. So what did Bill 23 change? It allows a maximum of 2 ADUs within a single detached, semi-detached, or town or row house dwelling. So those can be 2 ADUs within a primary building or 1 ADU in the primary building and 1 ADU in the accessory building. There can be no minimum unit size. Now, Bill 23 also prevented municipalities from enacting stricter regulations that would prohibit the combinations which I just mentioned. It cannot require more than 1 parking space for each ADU, limit the tenancy of an ADU, which I'll get into more in a second, and there's no appeal on the number of ADUs allowed in the zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there can be only a maximum of 1 parking space for each ADU, and the parking, if there's more than 1, can be provided in tandem. There's no limitation on the occupancy of an ADU, meaning that future tenants do not have to be related to the property owner or the primary resident, nor does the owner need to live on site, meaning that you can own a house and you can rent out each of the additional dwelling units and not have to live there. Next slide, please. The date of construction of the primary dwelling, ADUs are permitted regardless of the date of the primary dwelling was constructed. You will see in some municipal planning frameworks, specifically more for like surplus farm dwelling severances, sometimes there's limitations on whether or not they're allowed based on the date the primary residence was constructed. That's not allowed. And these will, of course, have impacts on parcels that are on municipal services, which are most of the lots within the town of Petrolia. Next slide, please. So the proposed ADU framework we're bringing to council for consideration would apply these changes from Bill 23 in order to create consistency across the policy and the framework. ADUs added to the primary buildings are limited to internal conversions of those buildings, so no additions to buildings beyond those required for fire or building code. We would also establish some new setbacks for ADUs in accessory buildings, and there would be larger setbacks for ADUs above a private garage to help address privacy concerns. Next slide, please. ADUs cannot be severed on another parcel of land. They can also not be developed on a partial or portion thereof that has an environmental protection zoning. Again, environmental protection zones are zones that are subject to flood hazards, erosion hazards, significant natural heritage features such as wetlands, woodlots, etc. Variances can still be considered for ADUs to the maximum size, the lot coverage via the typical committee of adjustment process and reviewing the 4 tests for minor variances under the Planning Act. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, ADUs can provide additional housing options to assist new arrivals to the town. They can help assist homeowners with mortgages and support downsizing or multi-generational housing. This proposed framework aligns with Bill 23 and supports efforts to address the varying housing needs the province is experiencing. ADUs are still required to get other permits, such as building, fire, plumbing, electrical. If it's within a regulated zone by the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, they will still be required to get those, as those must be legally attained as part of the construction process. Next slide, please. So my recommendation today is that the Town of Petrolia Council approve the zoning bylaw amendment and to amend the regulations for additional dwelling units in the Town of Petrolia's zoning bylaw, and that this bylaw be brought forward to the next scheduled council meeting. That bylaw is attachment 1 at the end of my report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Benjamins. Please be seated. I think at this time, I'd like to ask Mrs. Pearson, do we have any written requests that have come in to address this council?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have received nothing in writing.
Okay.
But I do have someone who wishes to address council verbally.
Well, that's fine. I'm going to ask the public for that at this time then. So maybe we can take them first. So at this time, I will open it up to anyone present to address council regarding this proposed zoning bylaw amendment. Who is that individual?
Mr. Chris Brait from Redwood Crescent.
Okay, Mr. Brait, please come forward. And for the record, please state your address too, please.
Great. 285 Redwood Court. Mayor, councilors. So I have some questions, and maybe most of them are for Trevor. So I don't.
You still will go through me, yes.
Okay. All
Yep.
right. So first question I have is, what is the maximum square footage per separate accessory building in the zones? So we have residential zone 1, 2, and 3. Currently, they have percentage of your lot value, and there's 30%, 30%, 35%. So what would be their maximum square footage?
Mr. Benjamins, can you address that through me, please?
Through your worship, the maximum size for accessory structures within the Town of Petrolia, according to our zoning bylaw, is approximately 721 square feet. That's 67 square meters, I believe. Obviously, there is buildings within the Town of Petrolia that do exceed that through minor variances.
Okay. All right. So part of that question again is placement or location. So can I put one in my front lawn?
Mr. Benjamins, will you speak to that, please?
Through your worship, no, they're really only permit. They would still have to follow the general guidelines for accessory structures. So they need to be located either in the interior side yard or the rear yard. As I mentioned, there will be increased setbacks for ADUs in accessory structures, 3 meters for structures that are above the garage from both your rear lot line and your interior lot line, and 1.5 meters if it's not an above garage, but still in an accessory structure.
All right, thank you. Will there be an allowance for, let's say my neighbor puts one in his backyard, will I be allowed to install a privacy barrier to block any backyard ADUs?
Mr. Benjamins, go ahead, please.
Currently, we do allow fences within the Town of Petrolia. Fences do need to comply with the provisions outlined within our fence bylaw. We have required additional setbacks for ADUs in accessory structures to help alleviate privacy concerns. But at this time, I don't think that would be allowed in response to it. Like, I don't think that is permitted within our fence bylaw, although I'd be happy to take a closer look at that.
All right, thank you. So my next question is, have you contacted Blue Water Power and the Ontario Clean Water Association? Have they been contacted for input regarding this amendment? And if the max consumption calculations have been done to ensure our existing infrastructure can handle the additional loads So I'm talking sewer, water, and electrical power.
I can probably speak to that. That would probably go through the town, but I will let Mr. Benjamin speak to that if he likes.
Yes, through your worship, it does need to be capacity, obviously, for ADUs to be permitted. I just want to say that I don't expect the entire town to be able to establish ADUs. A lot of residents and lots within the town of Petrolia are somewhat restricted as what they can do on their lot, given the size of their lot, the current size of the house. Maybe they're very close to their maximum lot coverage. So there's a number of things that would come into play. That being said, servicing, we still require each lot to be connected to municipal services, and that will be subject to review by the town's engineer.
Okay.
If I can add to that too, right now, our sewer use bylaw, we have lots of capacity, and as well as our water, we have lots of capacity.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So regarding electrical, would they have their own, would each ADU have their own meter? So would they have to run off of the Blue Water Power Service right on that lot? Or would they share from the primary dwelling?
Good point. Mr. Benjamin, can you speak to that again, please?
I unfortunately am not able to answer that right now. I can look that up and get back to you. But as I mentioned in my report, you're still required to get a separate approval, such as electrical and building permits. So I think that's probably a question that building might be able to answer. I unfortunately don't have the answer to that at this time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the other thing I was going to say is, do you think that a feasibility study would be beneficial for the town to see that all these extra loads can be handled? Because I realize that not everyone is going to have an ADU, but the potential is there.
Are you talking about an individual or a town feasibility study?
A feasibility study that all our infrastructure, existing infrastructure, can handle the potential for, you could have 25% extra load put on your services.
I would think that wouldn't be necessary, but I'll ask Mr. Benjamin if he'd like to speak to that.
Through your worship, the ADUs, I just want to be clear, Bill 23 that received royal assent in 2022 did make these changes mandatory, and they are already permitted to have ADUs as of right. This framework, which we're bringing to council for consideration, really just provides consistency across all of those policies. So I do appreciate the point, but these ADUs are kind of already permitted as of right.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, it's already mandatory, so it wouldn't matter if we've got to report what it said. We have to do this.
Okay, I understand that. But if the existing infrastructure can't handle the load, then there would have to be upgrades required, correct?
That's right. But again, other than I can't speak to Blue Water Power either, but as Mr. Benjamin stated, you still have to get your building permit and all your permits through the county, and that would be addressed at that time.
Right. Okay, and then, so one of my last questions is, once the setbacks are adjusted, and my thing is, does the town council not have any concerns about neighbors of these newly installed accessory buildings complaining about them regarding the sight lines?
Mr. Benjamin's?
Through your worship, I think that's why we've taken a very close look at other municipalities and how they've implemented ADUs, and I think that's why we've come up with the proposed framework that would increase setback distances from both the interior side and rear lot lines to help alleviate some of those concerns.
Right, thank you. And final question is, this is obviously an information session, but when will the vote be on it? You'll have to do more development?
If it's the motion's on the agenda for council tonight, and if it's approved, it will come to our next regular council meeting with the necessary bylaw for final approval. So
Will that have all these setbacks and all these dimensions and everything in place at that time?
Benjamin's?
Through your worship, yeah, the draft bylaw does include what the setbacks for ADUs would be. And again, I can tell you that it's 3 meters for accessory units that are above a garage and 1.5 meters for ADUs within accessory structures from both the rear and back and side lot lines.
Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Braid, for coming to address this public meeting. Okay, I'll open it up. Is there anyone here present that would like to address this public meeting? Please come forward. Andy, state your address or your name and address, please.
My name's Andy Hartz. I live on 562 First Avenue. Worship, council, staff, and members of the public. Two additional questions, please. Would 2 detached ADUs be allowed rather than 1 as part of the main structure and 1 detached? To give a total of 2. Would that be under a variance, for example?
Benjamins, would you speak to that, please?
The town may consider a variance for that, but the proposed framework that is already within our official plan is a combination of 1 ADU in the primary residence and 1 in the accessory structure, or 2 in the primary residence. So our current framework does not allow for that within our official plan, and the combinations are really meant to be 2 in the primary residence and only 1 in the accessory. So our framework would not allow 2 accessory ADUs
At the current time.
at the proposed time and the current time, yes.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Second question is, point has been raised about adequacy of power supply. Could solar panels be considered as something that could be attached to the ADUs just as they are to the primary residence?
That's an interesting question. I think any of those panels would have to be approved by council. And I don't know where you'd put them in the town, but I'll ask Mr. Benjamins if he has anything to add to that.
Through your worship, we may be able to consider that, obviously pending what Blue Water Power's comments are on that and buildings comments. I did attend an ADU conference some time ago, and I did see a number of tiny homes which did utilize those. So it may be an option, but I unfortunately can't give you a solid answer on that right now.
And lastly, we're very familiar with basements. Can we add build the ADU on a basement?
I think my understanding, and I'll ask Mr. Benjamins to speak to that as well. I think his report did say you could do that, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Through your worship, that is correct.
So yes, you can do that.
So effectively you double the square footage. 721, unless you have 320 above and 320 below.
Mr. Benjamins, go ahead.
Through your worship, an additional dwelling unit can be in the basement of the primary residence. However, ADUs, you cannot have an addition on your house for the sole purpose of having more ADUs. As I mentioned in my presentation and my report, ADUs are really only permitted through internal conversions of existing buildings, meaning that if you have an existing building and you convert the basement, you can have an ADU in the basement, but you cannot build a much larger house just to establish an ADU.
Okay, thank you for coming to address this public meeting. All right, is there anyone here wishing to address this public meeting at this time? Okay. Seeing none, I just want to report then that there is a motion proposed for council tonight to approve. That will take it to the next council meeting for the final approval of the bylaw to put it into force and effect. I will ask before we close, or I close this, is there any clarifications or questions from council to the planner at this time? Deputy Mayor Field.
Yeah, through you, your worship. To Mr. Benjamin, my question is, how many applications have come forward since the province mandated this?
Mr. Benjamins, go ahead.
Through your worship, to Deputy Mayor Field, we have not had any applications to date per se, but there has been some interest within the town of Petrolia to look at options. Like I said, Petrolia does have some limitations with lot sizes within the town. However, there are some, I do suspect there will be some applications that move forward following this housekeeping amendment.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council or clarification at this time? Councillor Hyatt.
Sorry, thank you. Through you, just a question. If someone has a garage in their backyard that's within 1.5 meters from the lot line, can they put one above that garage, or they have to offset it so that it's going to be the building or the actual dwelling is within 3 meters from the property line?
Mr. Benjamins, go ahead.
Through your worship to Councillor Hyatt, the ADU itself would have to be, if it was above a garage, it would have to be 3 meters from the property line. That being said, if it's maybe slightly between 1.5 and 3, they could be able to look at doing a variance for that within an existing building.
Okay with that? Any other questions last time for council questions or clarification? If not, then this will be dealt with tonight by motion, and the bylaw will be part of the next regular meeting. I will declare this public meeting closed.